He has just 4 lines, and yet he's a fan favorite. And in the minds of a lot of fans, he is the Mandalorian. But is he actually even a Mandalorian? He has the sweet armor, he's got the groovy jetpack, and he even has the cool wrist-mounted grappling gun. For those who only know Star Wars from the movies, he's the bounty hunter who loves disintegrations, and for years, he was our only glimpse of the legendary Mandalorian warriors. That is, until later additions to the canon have suggested that he's not a Mandalorian at all, but an imposter. But is he an imposter? Well, let's find out. He made his first appearance in the most inauspicious ways a Star Wars character can. Buried in an animated short in the legendary Star Wars Christmas special, where we were also introduced to Life Day and a singing Princess Leia. The 70s. In that short animated film, the relentless bounty hunter had more lines than he would over the course of 2 movies, where he still managed to be a menacing threat. That is, until a bit of Three Stooges shenanigans ignited his jetpack and sent him into the Sarlacc pit. Regardless, Boba Fett remained a fan favorite. He had the coolest action figure and a mysterious background, including the Mandalorians, the elite troops of legend. It all seems straightforward. He's got the Mandalorian armor, he's the only Mandalorian we've seen. Does it really matter what the backstory of the bounty hunter who brought a frozen Han Solo is? Not really, but since he is a famous bounty hunter, people would know it, or part of it. With the growing popularity of Star Wars, that living universe began being explored in novels and comics in what became known as the Extended Universe. For a time, anything that happened in that extended universe was canon. Now Star Wars had a team of creators and not just George Lucas, creators who filled in the blanks and built on the world suggested in the movies. In that legendary world, Boba Fett was not only unquestionably a Mandalorian, he eventually rose to the role of Mandalore, leader of the Mandalorians. You don't get much more Mandalorian than that. In fact, the supermarine armor that Fett wears at one point was canonically designed by a Fett. With all of that, how could one possibly think Boba Fett isn't a Mandalorian? Well, welcome to the weird and wild world of what is and is not canon. While the novels and comic books were all considered canon, they all also tended to rewrite each other. While it was George's baby, there was no real Kevin Feige guiding from the top. And it also didn't prevent George himself from stepping in and changing things up as they were always intended. That's what happened in 2010 during a few episodes of the Clone Wars animated series. When Obi-Wan Kenobi goes to Mandalore to find out if the legendary warriors had taken a side in the Clone Wars, he found out 2 things. First, there was a splinter group called Death Watch who had their very own plans and even their own lightsaber, the Darksaber, which excitingly enough is what Moff Gideon used to cut himself out of the wreckage, but they also learned that Jango Fett wasn't really a Mandalorian, just a guy in some surplus armor. And talking about that episode, showrunner Dave Filoni said that this was the portrayal of the Mandalorians that George Lucas had always intended, as an elite fighting force. If Jango wasn't a Mandalorian, then his son wasn't one either, just a guy in an old suit disintegrating people across the galaxy for cash. In 2012, George Lucas decided that rather than trying to continue the Star Wars story himself, he'd prefer something in the order of $4 billion for his other passion, education, and sold the franchise to Disney. Disney, among other things, is known for taking strict control of their properties, and the messy free-for-all of the extended universe, or Legends as we now know it, was not something they were interested in reconciling. So, the decks were cleared. From that point forward, if it didn't happen in a movie or animated series, it didn't happen. No more Boba Fett as Mandalore, no more of the conflicting backstories. Boba was the clone of Jango who got Mandalorian armor that Boba eventually got as well, with now Disney-sanctioned material simplifying both his background and his future. Well, some of his future. Now we're back to where we started with what we knew about Boba. He was a feared bounty hunter, he wore Mandalorian armor, and he went into the Sarlacc pit. If you haven't watched the second episode of The Mandalorian and have not been on the internet since then, skip ahead 15 seconds to avoid this spoiler, okay? Alright, for the rest of us up to date, we know that he survived the Sarlacc pit because we saw him menacingly watching the titular Mandalorian ride off with his armor in tow after taking it off a small town sheriff. So, that settles it then, right? Boba Fett's not a Mandalorian in the current lore of Star Wars. Well, let's look at what it even means to be a Mandalorian. Mandalorians might be easily recognizable from their armor and distinctive helmets, but underneath it gets a little trickier, and that's before you get to the Mandalorians' helmet rule. That is because the Mandalorians, while they have a homeworld, are not a race or a species, but an order. In this case, there is some degree of agreement between the legendary Mandalorian history and the new canon of the Mandalorian. In broad strokes, the warrior class of the Mandalorian decided to allow anyone in who would follow the creed of the Mandalorians. In this way, they sort of became the French Foreign Legion of Space. When you get a bunch of warriors from all over the place and let them join an elite fighting force, things can get complicated. At the core of what it means to be a Mandalorian is a variation of 6 basic rules, all stemming from a code called the Resol'nare. The 6 points are: wear the armor, speak the language, defend yourself and your family, raise your kids in the Mandalorian tradition, contribute to your clan's welfare, and when it happens, heed the call of Mandalore. There have been variations of these rules as the Mandalorians have evolved, including the Codes of Honor and the Super Commando Codex. The latter expanded those rules into the hundreds and caused a civil war among the Mandalorians themselves between those who adopted the Codex, the Death Watch who adhered to the simpler version, and the pacifist wing. There have been other additions to what is considered Mandalorian law. The most confusing perhaps revolves around one introduced in the Mandalorian series. Mandalorians do not take off their helmets around other living beings. This is in contrast to other Mandalorians we've seen in the animated series Clone Wars and Rebels, where those helmets were coming off all the time. This suggests that the whole splintering of the Mandalorian Code thing is not a settled matter among the Order. So then, if the Mandalorians disagree on what it is to be a Mandalorian, then what does it mean to be one? The simplest thing to do is to go back to the beginning and the Resol'nare. The Codes of Honor and the Super Commando Codex both take their inspiration from those 6 core laws, with later administrations adding on to it things that they thought were left out. How does that apply to the man we used to think of as the quintessential Mandalorian? And are you tired of the word Mandalorian yet? Well, we're almost there. Just like Boba Fett without the extended universe, we don't know that much about Jango. We know that he was a famous bounty hunter. We know that at one point he was approached by a Sith Lord to be the template for an army of clones. We know that he had a suit of Mandalorian armor, and we also know that he had a special untampered-with clone of himself made just for him. Little Boba Fett. We know that at least the leader of the pacifist faction of the Mandalorians didn't like him very much, and didn't consider him a Mandalorian. It's entirely possible that she just might not have been up to date on the Mandalorian membership list, or just disagreed with whoever decided Jango was part of the gang. Going by the Resol'nare point by point. Wear the armor. Well, that's the easiest checkmark. Both Jango and Boba have worn the armor. That would mean that up until the moment he mysteriously watches the Mandalorian ride off with his armor, he even abided by the helmet rule. But that's the easy one. If that was all it took, Timothy Oliphant wouldn't have had to give up his armor to a frustrated Mandalorian who was hoping to find a legitimate member of his order. Next is speak the language. Well, if the geek fight over Boba Fett wasn't enough, prepare to get even further into the weeds about one line in Attack of the Clones. When Obi-Wan is meeting Jango for the first time, Jango knows that he's there to out him as the hired gun that he totally was. To keep the secret going, he asks Boba to close the door to the closet where the armor is in a different language. Was that Mandalorian? Well, it depends on who you ask and where they got it from. In one novelization, it says it's a coded language. In another young reader book, it's Huttese. And in a script excerpt from an Art of Star Wars book, it's also marked as Huttese. The Star Wars YouTube Kids channel identified it as the Fett Code in 2019. If it's Fett Code instead of Huttese, and the code is derived from Mandalorian languages, then he is speaking the language. Next is defend yourself and your family. This one's easy. Jango defends his clone son, and his clone son returns the favor from the gunner spot on Slave 1. After his father's death, Boba becomes obsessed with avenging him, involving other bounty hunters in several plots. Jango has clearly trained his offspring in his ways, as he follows his father's footsteps to become a famous bounty hunter, possibly settling the next rule. The next two are tricky as they have to do with clans. At no point do either Jango or Boba ever appear to be in a clan, but after the Empire tried to eliminate the Mandalorians and their own internal conflicts, the Mandalorians also appear to be scattered. If you consider the fractured nature of the Mandalorians and the rules of the Resol'nare, then you could argue that your childhood favorite is still a Mandalorian. Well, we'll hear from him soon once he's done ominously watching things through binoculars. Well, that's why it seems like Boba Fett is a Mandalorian after all. What do you think? Is Boba always a Mandalorian, or is he as much Mandalorian as Pluto is a planet? Let us know in the comments, and while you're there, be sure to subscribe to CBR for the latest content in your inbox. Because this is the way.